We're back with episode 25 of Transformers Generation 1 Season 2, Make Tracks. So let's get after it. This is Energon Entries. Welcome back to Energon Entries, everybody. As always, this is your host, Matt Freites, and I hope that this finds you well. I hope you enjoyed last episode. I know it's been a couple of weeks, and with that, I'm going to be announcing a change in the cadence of the show going forward. There's some changes that are coming to my personal life in terms of my everyday job, and so I need to make sure that I can still give you quality content without overloading myself in the schedule. So I will let you know and make an announcement about that. I hope that you enjoyed last episode. I appreciate everybody tuning in. And with that, let's get to the episode recap. The episode begins with two thugs carjacking a familiar-looking car which transforms into Tracks, an Autobot, while its stereo turns into Blaster. The would-be criminals and their chop shop boss are quickly apprehended with help from Optimus Prime and the NYPD as the Autobots work alongside law enforcement to combat crime. While Prime suspects Decepticon activity nearby, the Autobots have yet to locate them. Tracks, enjoying the city, ventures out solo and encounters trouble, crashing after being shot by some punks. He's discovered by Raul, a young man who initially plans to sell Tracks to a shady gang. However, upon realizing Tracks is alive, Raul repairs him, and the two form an unlikely partnership. Tracks deduces the gang is tied to Decepticon operations, and together they track stolen cars to the Geddes brothers, who are collaborating with Megatron. Meanwhile, Starscream leads the Autobots on a wild chase, and Prime calculates the Decepticons' base is in the Pine Barrens. At the Decepticon facility, Megatron reveals plans to turn stolen cars into a drone army, but Tracks is captured during reconnaissance. With Raul's quick thinking and bravery, Tracks is saved, and reinforcements arrive to drive off the Decepticons. The Autobots face a fierce battle as the car drones attack New York, transforming into armed guards. Blaster disrupts their control frequency, allowing the Autobots to shift focus to the Decepticons' base. Raul plays a key role again, using ingenuity to disable Megatron, forcing the Decepticons into retreat. The Autobots destroy the factory, shutting down the drone army. The episode ends with Tracks and Raul returning to Sparkplug's garage, where Raul is roped into helping repair the damaged cars. A fitting end for a young hero who proved his worth to the Autobots. So this episode gets back to what I consider the new formula in the series, and it's the new formula where we see one singular robot kind of singled out during an episode. This plot in particular stayed on Earth. We've seen a lot of space travel recently, and I thought it was a very humanized plot. I kind of liked the fact that the Autobots were helping out here. And as it relates to the humans, the episode begins showing what appears to be a seedy part of some American city. It's later revealed to be New York City, which makes a lot of sense, but at first you don't really know what it is. Geography is a little bit shady in this show. The thugs are portrayed with mohawks and spiked belts and such, and to me that's very cliche. It makes a lot of sense for the 80s when this came out. The voices of the initial criminals to me sounded very similar to some of the Autobots, and you're going to have that with voice acting. It's just sometimes they don't do enough to mask the voices, and they sound exactly the way that the Autobot voices do. Raul was an interesting human character here, and him finding Tracks randomly and then deciding to repair him in the, quote, middle of the night. It wasn't even midnight according to the episode. Where does he get the parts from is what I wondered at first. And then Tracks later on, maybe a minute or two later, asking the same question. It made me laugh because a lot of times I have these thoughts in my head while I'm watching, and I put them out here for you on this podcast. But every so often, an Autobot usually has some moment of awareness where they say or ask a question that I'm asking in my head. And this was one of those moments, and I love that whoever was writing this episode, whoever had some type of influence on this storyline, they had this continuity piece in mind. Now, Raul proves to be a really good friend because not only does he repair Tracks and go with him, but later on in the episode, he proves to be a good friend by putting his life on the line. He confronts Megatron and his crew to save Tracks' life. Tracks is going in, he's going to be chopped up, he can't speak, and Raul goes in there and really risks his life to do so. As it relates to the Autobots, Tracks is the highlight of this episode. As I said earlier, it's back to this new formula. We find out through this episode that Tracks has an affinity for humans, and his fellow Autobots kind of make fun of him about it, which I found interesting, because all throughout this series, every time there is some type of a skirmish, every time Megatron tries to do something, 9 times out of 10, he is using the humans as a meat shield, a literal meat shield, and Optimus Prime and the Autobots have to make a decision, and most of the time, they go and save the humans. So here, for Tracks to have an affinity for humans, love human life, love New York City, and for the Autobots to kind of make fun of him, I thought that was interesting. It's probably just something that's singular to this episode and not necessarily an overall theme. I just found it interesting because it goes against the way we've seen the Autobots portrayed. Now, Tracks also has a vain streak in him. He's kind of similar to Sunstreaker in that way, and that's one other observation that I've made over the last few episodes, maybe even 10 episodes, is that these new Autobots that are introduced, they have a lot of personality similarities to other Autobots or the OG Autobots, and that's something that we've seen here. Now, Tracks does crash his car. He's very worried about his nice new hood, his shiny hood. But one of the things that happens, Raul cuts a cable inside him. And this cable disables basically everything about Tracks. His voice is transforming everything. And Tracks himself tells us that this will turn me into an ordinary car. To me, this seems like way too simple and way too important of a cable for an alien life form. The Transformers are supposed to be sentient beings from another planet. Their technology is supposed to be updated, is supposed to be advanced. And so for one wire to do all of that for Tracks, it didn't really, for lack of a better word, track with how the Autobots have been portrayed. But during one of the chase scenes where Raul is trying to go after the people who tried to carjack him, we find out that Tracks can actually fly, but only in car form. And that's something that has been a limitation of the Autobots since the pilot, is they can't fly. Now, Blaster is in this for a very, very brief moment, and when the thugs originally hijack Tracks, Blaster is in there and they found this boombox and they play a song. Now, up until this point, the song has been just about the exact same. There have been so many scenes where we've seen or heard of music be played, and almost every time it's the same track. Here, it was a different track, so it was actually nice to hear a different track be played. Overall, it was interesting that the Autobots were involved in helping the police to stop a ring of car thieves. The Autobots have really been about their mission of stopping the Decepticons and getting back to Cybertron. And obviously, they've saved the humans in the process, but here they're actually taking an active role in what I consider very low-level law enforcement. I love it when Sparkplug, who I feel like we haven't seen in a while, that's something maybe I should have put up in human observations, but he says the Decepticons must be lying low when Optimus Prime asked him if there was any activity. And the thing is, they're always hiding. They always hide well. The Autobots can never find them. And the thing about this work that we talked about here is this work, while noble, and I'm talking about the police work, it just seems very beneath what the Autobots can offer humanity, that's all. But during all of this, the Autobots seem to have their bases covered in that they're trying to make sure that they have every element of the Earth covered, the air, the water, the land, and they have sent Autobots everywhere to try and find the Decepticons. And to an extent, it does work, as the crew of Autobots, we're talking about Powerglide and Cosmos, do find Starscream later in the episode and are able to chase him down. Now, once they find him, a small battle takes place inside this mall, and it takes place in New York City. There's a lot of people in New York City, and there's a lot of people in this mall, which, by the way, the mall gives me some nostalgia vibes because as a kid of the 90s, I went to the mall a lot, so it was really cool to see that. But Powerglide and Cosmos chase Starscream into this mall, and it's a very crowded mall, so that's a very dangerous move. However, like we established earlier, the time is about midnight. So why are there so many people in a mall at midnight? I understand that New York City is the city that never sleeps, but these stores definitely sleep, and I don't think you're going to find as many people in a Macy's as there are in this episode. It was kind of crazy, and the fact that the mall's open at midnight is just wild to me. But after all of that, the Autobots arrive in the Pine Barrens to rescue Tracks. Now, the thing about the Pine Barrens is that I think of The Sopranos. And The Sopranos is a show that obviously came way later than this, but the Pine Barrens is probably its most famous episode, at least that's the title of it. And so when I heard them talk about the Pine Barrens, it just made me think of that. But the Autobots that arrive to help out Tracks at the end of the episode, these are not the same Autobots that we saw when we saw a crew of Autobots the first time in New York City. As a matter of fact, they were all OG Autobots. So I'm assuming that Optimus Prime called in reinforcements after finding out what the Decepticons' plans were. And for all the crap that I gave Blaster, I mentioned him earlier that he played a different song. We didn't see much of him, but during Blaster Blues, I was not very complimentary of him. And in this episode, he didn't have a big role, but what he was asked to do, which was send a jamming frequency to disable the soldiers, he did that. He didn't say a word, and so Blaster, I'm sorry that I gave you so much grief. So how about the Decepticons? Well, the Decepticons actually weren't seen or heard from until about halfway through this episode, which is kind of unusual. It was revealed that the Decepticons were behind the ring of stolen cars and that they were working with the mob, of course, and that makes a whole lot of sense, obviously. But the Decepticons create this massive building in the Pine Barrens, which is something that I talked about earlier. And they're using this massive building. And when I say massive, I mean it is massive. And they are turning stolen cars into what then appear later in the episode to be like these drone machines. And of course, nobody found out about it. The Pine Barrens is, of course, out in the middle of nowhere, and there is a lot of areas in New Jersey where that is the case. But come on, I mean, again, how many buildings do they have to build before we can figure it out? And this thing was huge, and they are taking so many cars over there, and it amazes me that the Autobots can't find them, let alone humans. But once again, at the end of all of this, the Decepticons retreat super quickly. Raoul does something, he sprays his graffiti paint at Megatron, and it somehow overloads his circuits, and because of that, all of the Decepticons retreat. The Decepticons are very conditioned to retreat whenever Megatron is in trouble, and that's because the soldiers are a reflection of their leader. And while Megatron is a good leader in many senses, he's not a finisher, and in this episode, we saw it again. Animation errors. So maybe this isn't an error, but it's something I mention a lot of episodes, but sizing. Cosmos and Power Glide at certain points appeared to be really tiny, and especially when they were in the mall, they almost seem human-sized, but when they're transformed, they seem huge because their transformed modes are typically large vehicles, and so to see them transform inside of a mall like Cosmos is a UFO, to see him inside of a mall and not be massive inside the mall, just something that I picked up. Coloring, I did notice something. At one point, Huffer was all orange when he was in truck mode, when he usually has a little bit of purple in him. That was during the final battle. And during that same scene, one of the converted robot soldiers had a maroon hood that then turned to the green color that all of them are upon transforming. Overall, I felt like this episode was fine. It felt a little bit more like an episode of, let's say, Law and Order, and it really didn't fit the mold of what we've seen from Transformers, but I did like the character development of Tracks. I did like seeing him have a genuine friendship with Raoul, and Raoul, I think, having a little bit of a character arc, even a mini one throughout this episode. Again, it didn't really do anything to further the what's happening in the larger battle for Cybertron, but it got the job done. It was entertaining, and we learned a little bit about Tracks. What did you think of this episode? Have you watched it recently? I would love to know. Find me on Instagram at EnergonEntriesPod is the handle. If you want to email me, the email address is mattyicemedia@gmail.com, and you can find that in the show notes. I'd love to hear from you. Next episode, we are going to be reviewing episode 26, the Autobot Run. I hope this finds everybody well. I hope this finds everybody safe, and I'll see you next time. This is Energon Entries. The opinions and viewpoints expressed on Energon Entries are those of Matt Freites and his guests, and not necessarily those of the Matty Ice Media Network. Energon Entries is exclusively owned by Matt Freites and is brought to you by the Matty Ice Media Network.